Hey, what's going on everyone? Time for another Talking Head video, and these are always powered by you guys. Basically, I'm always looking at my inboxes and my DMs and such, and I'm going, what are people asking me? And when I start to see a particular theme over and over and over again, I say, it's time to make a video. So today we're gonna make a video talking about some things that you should consider about your next build. We've been talking about this all year long. However, now that with the exception of RDNA 3 being launched, we have enough information to start giving you some guides on where to spend your money, depending on what it is that you need from your computer. The new Z790 Dark Kingpin motherboard from EVGA features a 14-layer PCB, 21-phase VRM, PCIe Gen 5, Wi-Fi 6, and a host of features to unlock the full potential of Intel's new 13th gen CPU. To see the complete list of features of the Z790 Dark Kingpin motherboard from EVGA, follow the link in the description below. Now remember, the major components of your system are going to be CPU, GPU, motherboard, power supply, RAM, graphics card, and storage. And then case is obviously, going to be subjective based on your parts and stuff. But today we're going to talk about specifically the motherboard and the CPU with some things to consider regarding your GPU. Now right now everyone's talking about CPUs because Intel's 13900K or 13th gen has just launched. 13900K, 13700K, 13600K. So now that we've got information regarding 13th gen and 7000 series now for AMD, which has been out for a while, you can start to really determine what your build is going to be based on that platform. Now the reason why I also say that you should kind of start off with your CPU platform before your GPU is that's going to sort of determine how far of a GPU you can go with. For instance, if you're gonna go with something like a mid-range CPU, let's say a 12600K or a 13600K or a 7600X, if you go with a really high-end like 4090 or something on like a mid-range CPU, you are more than likely going to end up bottlenecking it, especially if you're running an older generation. Because one of the things that's really important to talk about too, not in today's video, I actually got a whole couple video series coming where we do a complete used eBay type of build, is gonna be if you're running older hardware, how much limitation do you have before you start to just bottleneck your system, specifically your graphics card, where you then are leaving money on the table? Now let's talk about Intel and AMD for a second here because each one has its strengths and its weaknesses. Let's go ahead and start with Intel since it's newest here. Intel at the current time of filming is actually offering a better value than AMD. Now we're talking specifically about Intel's 13th gen versus AMD's 7000 series. Intel right now is compatible with both the DDR4 and DDR5. DDR4 is extremely cheap at the moment. DDR5 has come down in price quite a bit, but it's still a heck of a lot more expensive than DDR4. In most use cases, you're not gonna notice a difference of DDR4 versus DDR5 on a gaming rig or just a general computer that's doing live streaming, just kind of poking around on some Photoshop, maybe doing some light editing. You're not going to notice the speed increase of DDR5, but what you are gonna notice is the price increase. When it comes to Intel being a better value, it's because of the fact that you can still run older platform components. You can run it on a Z690 motherboard. Now you give up a couple of things when it comes to Z690, specifically in storage speed, direct lanes to the CPU through PCIe Gen 5, DDR5, that sort of stuff. But actually you can get DDR5 on Z690, but you can run it on DDR4 like I've already said, and you can run an older motherboard, one that's been out for a while, the price has come down, the manufacturing cost has come down, because right now Z790 boards are gonna be the most expensive on the market. So you can plop a 13th gen CPU into a used, lightly used, or just a lower tier Z690 motherboard and be up and running and have all the full feature sets in terms of speed, thermal velocity boost, all of the tuning and stuff that you would get with various Z series motherboards. All of them are gonna utilize PCIe Gen 5, Z690 and Z790, so there's no reason to worry about that. All the motherboards are gonna have plenty of PCI Express NVMe slots, so you're not really leaving a whole lot on the table. When it comes to AMD, however, the 7000 series and AM5 socket is a forward-facing platform. So that means they're gonna have longer compatibility into the future with future CPUs. So one of the things you have to consider if you're gonna go with Intel is right now you might be compatible with previous generation platform hardware, motherboard, RAM and such. Forward-facing stuff in any generations moving into the future are more than likely gonna require a new motherboard because of a new socket and probably gonna be DDR5 only. I have a feeling that the 12th gen, 13th gen overlap, because they really are built on the same process node. I mean, it's just enhancements that have taken place from 12th gen to 13th gen in a very layman's nutshell. 7000 series is forward facing, so if you adopt 7000 series now, you are gonna have longer compatibility into the future regarding motherboards and RAM than you will regarding Intel if you adopt 13th gen and stick with an older motherboard with DDR4. So you have to ask yourself, how far into the future are you planning on keeping this system? Most people keep their systems 5 years plus. One of the trends I'm noticing in a lot of the emails that I'm getting is people that are building their first system in the last 7 to 10 years. Now, 10 years ago, we were talking about FX processors. We were talking about Devil's Canyon 4790K CPUs. I mean, we have come a long way in the last 10 years. So anybody upgrading a system that old, no matter what you choose, is going to be a massive increase in performance than what you've seen in the past. Even if you went entry-level hardware, you went like 12600K, 10600K, and compared it to anything you would have 10 years ago, or 7 years ago even, it is going to be a massive uplift in performance. Now the thing about AMD is, like I said, they tend to keep a socket around for a lot longer. Intel sometimes will give you 2 generations on a socket and then there's a socket change. Whereas if we look at Zen, and we look at the 1000 series through 5000 series processors, we saw the same socket all the way across the board. And then the motherboard compatibility would depend on the BIOS that you were running. More often than not, if you were gonna run a newer CPU with an older motherboard, a BIOS update would give you compatibility for the newer CPUs, dropping compatibility for the older CPUs, which is fine because most of the time people don't go backwards in hardware. And not to mention the older CPUs like 3000 series, 2000 series, and even now 5000 series are only gonna get cheaper as time goes on. So that motherboard and that DDR5 is gonna last you a lot farther into the future. So if you're considering Intel and you can afford it, you might wanna consider DDR5 RAM and a DDR5 motherboard. That way in the future, if you wanted to upgrade the system and carry any of those components with you, at least you could take the RAM. AMD side, you're more than likely to be able to take the motherboard and the RAM with you. So keep that in mind. How big of a CPU do you need though? I mean, right now when it comes to all the benchmarks and stuff, all the brands like Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, and RDNA 3 when it comes out, obviously, these brands love to start at the top. They really like to flex all of their processing muscle because that's where they can claim victory on being who's got the world's fastest or world's biggest, et cetera, et cetera. That's really gonna depend on what your use case is. For the most part, I mean, it's not been that long ago where 4 cores and 8 threads was all anybody needed to get anything done in their life. You don't need a 32 thread CPU. I mean, Intel's top offering and AMD's top offering right now are 32 thread CPUs. If, however, you're looking at being able to just start broadening your horizons on things you want to tinker with, you want to start playing with virtual machines, you want to set up, virtual machines is basically where you just have just that. You portion off a piece of your hardware to run a computer in a virtual environment alongside your current operating system that's running. So you can make it look like you have multiple systems running at the same time. To do that, you have to obviously chop up your hardware virtually, and the more cores and the more RAM and stuff you have, the more availability you have to resources for those VMs. A lot of people run VMs to run things like servers and Plex servers and all that sort of stuff. So if you don't have any interest in that, and you're just looking at doing general computing, maybe some workloads, maybe some live streaming and some video editing and such, with encoding happening now on graphics cards, and it's been happening that way for years, but now that people are really starting to pay attention to it, you don't need a 32 core or 32 thread CPU. You don't. You can get away with the lower tier stuff pretty much in any use case. The only difference is gonna be how long it takes to do a multi-threaded task. For instance, if you're running Premiere, Adobe Premiere, and you've ever actually watched your task and CPU affinity allocation during the rendering process, you'll find that it's all happening on the GPU if that's the way it's set up by default in Premiere, which most of the time that it is. If you actually set it to any sort of CPU encoding, you'll notice that usually it's only a couple cores doing things. It is not a very highly multi-threaded platform. In fact, threads have exceeded the utilization of something like Adobe a long time ago. And it's one of the things that regular Adobe users have complained about is the fact that it does not scale well at all with hardware. So that's why encoding taking place on the GPU, that's gonna be more your concern when it comes to CPU. So unless you're doing stuff that specifically requires a high core count, and here's the thing, if you work in that environment or you live in that environment, you already know this video wouldn't be for you. This is for the person that's looking at, I'm upgrading my home PC that I wanna play some games on and I haven't really looked at this stuff in 5, 7, 10 years. Something like a 600 series from Intel, 12600K, 11600K, 10600K, like I've said, they're gonna be plenty fast, plenty of cores to do your job, plenty of cores to get your daily tasks done, and more than enough to play games and such. On AMD, it's the same thing. Ryzen 5 or an i5 more than enough to get the job done. The amount of RAM that you need, that's almost always a bragging point. Having fast RAM and having lots of it is never a problem, unless you're having to cut back somewhere else in your budget because you want to put 128 gigs of RAM in your system. Let's say you're running a 13600K with 128 gigs of RAM and like a 1060 GPU. That would be a pretty bad sacrifice to just say you have a lot of RAM. So there's a lot of balancing that needs to take place in your system builds. Motherboards is another area where manufacturers love to brag and show off. Motherboards have feature sets that, for the most part, a lot of times don't mean squat to anybody. Having XYZ number of PCIe Gen 5 lanes, having 52 NVMe slots, obviously I'm exaggerating here. Most people are gonna run 1, maybe 2 NVMe drives. Even PCIe Gen 3 NVMe right now would be like, if you're running a SATA SSD, or God forbid, a hard drive, any NVMe, PCIe Gen 3, 4, 5, doesn't matter, is going to give you the biggest performance uplift and usability in your system that you have ever seen. If you are still watching this video and you have never experienced an SSD, and I know you exist, I know you're out there, comment down below, I'm that guy. All you need to honestly make your system feel better is just even a SATA SSD, which has a max read write of 550 megabytes a second. PCIe Gen 3 NVMe, over 3,000 megabytes per second. PCIe Gen 5, almost 7,000 megabytes per second. Do the math on how many times faster that is versus your hard drive running on average anywhere between 80 to 100 megabytes per second. SSDs, important in your build. Definitely make sure and you know what's funny, 2 terabyte drives are, especially if you get a PCIe Gen 3 2 terabyte, have really come down in price. No reason not to have one in your build. At the very least, a 500 gigabyte NVMe SSD in your system to run your OS and your most commonly used programs. That alone, even on an old system, will be the biggest improvement you could possibly do. But when it comes to motherboards, I mean, let's talk about AMD for a second here. You got B650, X670, and X670E. So you got the Extreme 670 Extreme. Again, feature sets that most of the time aren't gonna mean anything to anyone unless you're out there building the biggest, baddest rig that you can to do some overclocking and just flex muscle. A B-series motherboard is more than enough for just about anybody ever when it comes to AMD's rig. And I'm talking about previous generations as well. Same thing goes for Intel. Although right now, I only have Z-series motherboards because I think for the most part, manufacturers and motherboard manufacturers have not done nearly as much of the B-series motherboards for Intel, even all the way down to H-series, which would be like the A-series on AMD, which is like the entry level, bare bones. But again, you don't wanna go super bare bones on your motherboard and then put an overclocking CPU in there or something that is designed for overclocking because again, features you're paying for that are just not gonna be available to you on that motherboard. So mid-range motherboards, a B550, B650, perfectly fine. When those mid-range motherboards for 13th gen start showing up, or if you're going 13th gen and a 12th gen motherboard, get a $150 motherboard, $200 motherboard, last years and will never have a problem with it. Save yourself some money there so you can go with a better graphics card, more storage, better case, better power supply, whatever. When it comes to graphics cards, nobody needs an RTX 4090. Nobody. Even those people are like, but I work in the most demanding of workstation scenarios, then you need a Quattro. You don't need a 4090. It's not gonna actually give you the amount of performance that you would need in those types of scenarios because that's exactly what the Quattro cards are designed to do. So if you live in that, I do tons and tons of rendering and 3D graphics and stuff, then you would need something a lot more powerful than a 4090 to truly make your workload and your processing time fast enough that you're not sitting there waiting on rendering. 4090s are bragging points. 4090s are just, they're just flexes. And we love to see all the FPS and stuff, but nobody really needs more than a 60, maybe a 70 series card for NVIDIA, depending on what your resolution is. And your graphics card that you choose is gonna depend entirely on the resolution and games that you play. So if you were to say, I have a 1080p panel and all I play is CSGO, well, running an RTX 4090, that's not gonna do you any favors whatsoever. Wait for the 70 series and 60 series cards to come out. If you're running 1080p, even 1440p, getting something like a 3060 Ti or something like a 6700 XT on AMD or in a 6600 XT, gonna give you plenty of performance to play your games without breaking the bank. But speaking of resolution, ultra-wides are starting to make a rise in popularity. For a while there was 1080p vertical height ultra-wides. 3440 by 1440 or WQHD or wide QHD is really making a jump in popularity now. So if you're gonna be running an ultra-wide screen, don't look at that 1440p number and say, oh, I'm running 1440p, because the horizontal pixels are significantly more than a 16:9 when you go to 21:9. So you might want to step your GPU up one whole notch if you're running an ultra wide. In fact, we should start doing some ultra wide benchmarks just so people can see what the actual performance hit is with those extra horizontal pixels. The nice thing about graphics cards is, as long as you don't underspec your CPU and your motherboard too far, you can always upgrade the graphics card later and get that uplift immediately. However, if you go super entry on your CPU and your motherboard, then you're gonna be limited to how much graphics card you can put in there before you start bottlenecking it, which means you paid for FPS you're not getting, period. Now, all of this I'm mentioning NVIDIA right now is because we're still waiting for RDNA 3's launch coming in just about a week and a half here. But then we'll know what all the details look like, then we'll start to get hands-on and testing, and we'll start to be able to see what the newest gen from Radeon looks like. But just like 4090, I have no doubt they're gonna start at the top of the stack, and it will take time for those mid-range cards to come out. So if you're looking at a mid-range build or an average like $1,000 to $1,500 build, you're gonna be looking at 3000 series anyway, because you can't even get a 4090 for less than about $2,000 at the time of making this video. But when it comes to picking your platform, it really is gonna depend on, I guess, a lot of your preferences in the programs that you run. The nice thing about this though is this is one of the first times where in the past, talking about AMD versus Intel, it usually was like Intel was the most stable in Windows environment. It was the most compatible with programs not having any sort of weird conflicts with the instructions and the way that AMD would handle it. We always would say Intel had the best compatibility and overall had the better performance than AMD. But that's not true this time around. In fact, even though the Intel on average, the 13th series, is holding higher clock speeds than AMD, and these are the highest clock speeds we've ever seen by AMD, up to 5.8 gigahertz, the AMD still overall feels more fluid and smooth in Windows than 13th gen does. We are talking about the fact that you'd probably need a high-speed camera to start measuring the differences on how fast a window pops up on either of these two platforms, but it's noticeable in how smooth and fluid AMD is. But I can tell you right now, when it came to testing the 13th gen, I had a couple more random crashes or program not wanting to launch when I'm doing the benchmarks, or a certain game not wanting to start, than I had with AMD, and this was a never before seen platform for any of us, whereas this is built on an existing platform. So the fact that it had weird nuances on Intel's side was kind of strange to me. We were able to work through it. It's one of those things where, it wasn't consistent, so I couldn't even nail down exactly what it is. It's the kind of thing we always just attribute and chalk up to the fact that it's a brand new platform and it takes time for Windows updates and BIOS updates and stuff to sort of fix those problems. On AMD, however, it has been an amazingly solid experience. I can tell you that when it comes to my next rig, now that I've seen 13th gen, I'm pretty convinced I'm still gonna go with a 7950X. Although in terms of value, it's not as good as Intel's because it's more expensive, and it's trading blows with Intel's 13th gen, which is $120 cheaper at the top tier 13900K level. The overall use experience for me has been smoother and more pleasant on AMD. In fact, when it comes to the Port Royal overclocking and stuff, I have not been able to achieve the same scores I was getting on AMD on Intel with the same setups. So I don't know what that's all about. Again, brand new platform, might take some time for some microcode updates to take place with both BIOS and operating system, but time will tell, things will mature, and they always do. I hope this video has given you some things to think about when it comes to building your next platform. I think the biggest takeaway, if you're stuck in that whole Intel AMD, it really comes down to a couple of things, and I'm gonna sort of too long didn't read this version at the end. Intel has a better value because you can still run DDR4 and an older motherboard on it, or a current motherboard with DDR4, and not have to spend the extra money on DDR5. AMD, however, requires DDR5 and an AM5 socket. However, it will carry longer upgrade path in the future because they will be hanging onto the AM5 socket for a couple of generations at least, whereas Intel definitely every 1 to 2 generations completely changes the socket. And any upgrades in the future for Intel will more than likely be DDR5 only. So it really depends on what your initial budget is. If you're trying to get the most for the least amount of money, and you're looking at new hardware and you're not looking at going with used stuff, Intel is gonna be the cheaper way to build at the moment, just because of the fact that there's those new forward-facing technologies required for AMD. But that's not to say you can't still find 5000 series CPUs that are brand new and 12th gen CPUs that are brand new that offer you the same exact performance as you could get currently on Intel's 13th gen. Because you can still run, like I said, a 12th gen CPU with that setup and then upgrade to a 13th gen in the future. And based on our charts that we showed you, that's a pretty major uplift in its own right. All right, guys, What are you looking for in a CPU? Just average gaming use? Are you kind of doing a little bit of everything? Maybe some work, some schooling, some live streaming, some gaming? I'm kind of curious as to what it is you guys do with your computers all day. Keep it PG, though. I don't want to know about that. Playing Fresh Woman or whatever it is. Don't look it up. Please don't look it up. You're gonna. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next one.